The smell hit me first, that particular combination of aged newsprint, dusty cardboard, and the faintly sweet musk of deteriorating adhesive that only decades-old comic books produce. It filled my nostrils as I inhaled, a scent so visceral it made my chest tighten. My fingers rested on something smooth and cool, the protective mylar sleeve crackling softly under my palm. Somewhere below, a door slammed, and my mother's voice, that voice, the one that could freeze water at 20 paces, spiraled up the stairs like smoke. "Daniel, your sister needs to talk to you." I opened my eyes. The ceiling was wrong. Not wrong exactly. Familiar. The water stain in the corner shaped like a dragon. The glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck up there when I was 12, half of them already fallen and leaving behind tiny adhesive scars. My ceiling from 30 years ago. My childhood ceiling. My heart began hammering against my ribs, a percussion that had nothing to do with exercise and everything to do with impossibility. I sat up slowly, and the comic book that had been resting on my chest slid down into my lap. The Amazing Spider-Man, #300. First appearance of Venom. The black cover gleamed under the afternoon light slanting through my window. No, not my window. My teenage window with the view of the oak tree I used to climb, the one they'd cut down in 2008. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real, but the smell was real. The weight of the comic in my hands was real. And when I lifted it closer, inspecting the pristine corners, the unblemished spine, I saw my own reflection in the plastic sleeve. A face without crow's feet. Without the deep grooves between the eyebrows that decades of frowning had carved. Smooth skin, dark hair without a strand of silver. The face I'd had at 17. "Daniel Marcus Chen, I know you can hear me." My mother's voice again, and this time I recognized not just the tone, but the exact timbre, the specific register she used when she was building up to something. When she had a favor to ask that wasn't really a favor but a command dressed in maternal guilt. I stood, my legs feeling strange, too light, too easy. No creaking knee, no lower back stiffness that I'd learned to stretch out every morning. I crossed to the mirror hanging on the back of my door, and there I was, 17 years old, skinny in a way I'd forgotten I'd ever been, wearing a faded X-Men t-shirt that I'd donated to Goodwill in 1997. 1997. The year stitched itself into my consciousness like a surgeon's suture. April 1997. I knew this moment. God help me, I knew this moment. He's probably up there with his little picture books. My sister Melissa's voice floated up, syrupy with condescension, like always, while the rest of us deal with the real world. My hands clenched, the comic book bent slightly in my grip before I caught myself, horror flooding through me at the thought of damaging it. Even now, even in whatever fever dream or psychotic break or genuine temporal impossibility this was, the instinct to protect these pages ran deeper than breath. I set the Spider-Man down gently on my bed, making sure it was perfectly flat, and walked to the door. My hand on the doorknob felt young, unmarked by the burn scar I'd gotten from a motorcycle exhaust in 2003. The scar that didn't exist yet. Wouldn't exist if I... No, I couldn't think like that. Couldn't let myself spiral into the metaphysics of it. Not yet. I opened the door and descended the stairs. The living room was exactly as I remembered it. The floral couch my mother had been so proud of. The coffee table with the ring stains from my father's whiskey glasses. The family photos on the mantel frozen in time. My father in his police uniform. Melissa at her high school graduation. Me, age 5, holding a toy lightsaber. They were all there. Mom, Dad, Melissa. And Melissa's fiancé, Trevor fucking Hartwick, with his perfectly gelled hair and his polo shirt with the little horse on it, standing with his arm around my sister's waist like he owned her. Like he owned everything he touched. "There he is," Trevor said. Flashing that smile that I'd once thought was friendly and would later learn, was the smile of a man calculating the angles. The collector. The word sounded like an insult in his mouth. "Sit down, Danny," my mother said, patting the couch beside her. She was younger than I remembered her, 52 instead of 82, but the lines around her mouth were already deep, carved by years of pursing her lips in disappointment. "We need to have a family discussion." I remained standing. In my first life, in the life I'd already lived, I'd sat, I'd been compliant, I'd been the good son. "I'm listening," I said. My father shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That should have been my first warning back then. It was a neon sign now. As you know, Melissa began, her voice taking on that rehearsed quality that meant she'd practiced this speech. Trevor and I are getting married in September. September 14th, 1997. A Saturday. It had rained, not during the ceremony itself, but during the reception, and Melissa had cried. Not tears of joy, but of rage that her outdoor dinner had to be moved inside. I'd spent most of that night in the hotel bar, drinking away the hollowness in my chest. And we've been looking at venues, Melissa continued, and we found the perfect place, the Ashford Estate. You know, that gorgeous mansion with the gardens? I knew it. I'd seen the wedding photos 1,000 times. Melissa had kept them on display in her house even after the divorce, from her third husband, not Trevor. Trevor would last 12 years before running off with his dental hygienist. The thing is, Trevor interjected, and I watched his hand squeeze my sister's waist. The venue is a bit above our initial budget, and with the dress Melissa wants, the dress I need, Melissa corrected. It's a Vera Wang, Danny. A Vera Wang. I've dreamed about wearing a Vera Wang since I was a little girl. She was 24. I was 17. She'd never been a little girl to me, only a force of nature, a hurricane in human form who'd always gotten what she wanted through sheer volume and persistence. That's wonderful, I said carefully. I'm happy for you both. The dress is $12,000, my mother said, and there it was, the hammer dropping. And with the venue, the flowers, the photographer, they're short about $15,000. The number hung in the air like a sword. We were thinking, my father said, finally looking at me, and I could see the apology already forming in his eyes, the preemptive guilt, that maybe you could help out. How? I asked, though I knew. Of course I knew. Your comics, Melissa said, and she couldn't quite keep the eagerness out of her voice. You must have hundreds of them up there. Thousands, maybe, and some of them have to be worth something, right? I saw on TV that old comics can sell for a lot of money. In my first life, I'd laughed. A bitter, hollow sound. Yeah, Mel, some of them are worth money, but the really valuable ones, those are from the 40s, 50s, Golden Age stuff. I don't have any of those. I have modern books. Most of them are worth cover price, maybe a few bucks more. I tried to explain it to them, the difference between vintage investment pieces and reader copies. I tried to make them understand that my collection wasn't a pile of cash waiting to be harvested, but they hadn't cared about the nuances. They'd only cared about the bottom line. So sell them, Trevor had said, shrugging like it was that simple, and eventually, worn down by weeks of argument, by my mother's tears and my father's sighs and Melissa's accusations that I was selfish, that I didn't care about family, that I loved picture books more than my own sister's happiness, I'd caved. I'd sold them. All of them. I'd gotten $8,000 from a dealer who'd offered me maybe 60% of their actual value, knowing I was desperate. He'd cherry-picked the best issues, the keys, the first appearances, and among them, in a long box with maybe 50 other random issues from the 80s and 90s. If he had been the amazing Spider-Man #300, I'd bought it in 1988 from a spinner rack at the local drugstore for 75 cents. I'd read it cover to cover a dozen times, marveling at Todd McFarlane's artwork, the way Venom's tongue lolled and his teeth gleamed. I'd eventually sleeved it and boarded it and put it in storage. A nice book, but not a grail. Not something I'd ever thought would change my life. In 2024, no, in the life I'd already lived, that comic had sold at auction for $525,000. $525,000. And I'd sold it in 1997 for maybe $3, included in a bulk lot, because my sister needed a designer dress for a marriage that would end in screaming matches and thrown dishes. The memory of seeing that auction result had nearly killed me. I'd been 62 years old, broke. Living in a studio apartment, working part-time at a comic shop because it was the only place that would hire someone my age with no real resume. I'd been scrolling through news on my phone when I saw the headline, and I'd had to sit down on the floor because my legs simply stopped working. $500,000. Gone because I'd been too weak to say no. But I wasn't 62 anymore. I was 17. And this time, no, I said. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. What? Melissa's face scrunched in confusion, as if I'd spoken a foreign language. I said no. I'm not selling my collection. My mother's expression shifted, reorganizing itself into the mask of maternal disappointment she wore so well. Danny, honey, this is your sister's wedding. Oh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. So is my collection, I said. My voice was steady. Strange how easy it was when you'd already lived through the worst version. I've been building it for years. Those comics mean something to me. They're comics, Trevor said, and there was an edge to his voice now. A glimpse of the man who would later embezzle from his father's construction company. They're for kids. You're almost an adult. Time to grow up. Growing up doesn't mean abandoning the things you love, I replied. It means making choices about what's truly important. And my collection is important to me. More important than family, Melissa's voice rose, hitting that frequency that used to make me flinch. More important than your own sister's happiness? Your happiness isn't dependent on a $12,000 dress, I said. You could get married in a burlap sack and it would be just as valid. The dress is what you want, not what you need. And I'm sorry, but I'm not funding your wants by sacrificing my own. My father stood up. Son, that's enough. We're trying to have a reasonable discussion here. No, Dad. You're trying to guilt me into giving up something I care about so that Melissa can have something she wants. That's not a discussion. That's an ambush. I could see the shock rippling across their faces. This wasn't the Danny they knew. The Danny who said yes, who kept the peace, who swallowed his objections and put family harmony above his own needs. That Danny had died alone in an apartment that smelled like mildew and regret. His only companion, a mangy cat from the shelter, and a stack of bills he couldn't pay. This Danny had already lived that life. You're being incredibly selfish, Melissa hissed. Do you know that? Incredibly, unbelievably selfish. Maybe, I acknowledged, or maybe I'm just setting a boundary. You can choose to respect it or not, but the answer is still no. My mother's eyes glistened with tears, the weapon she deployed when logic failed. After everything we've done for you, all the sacrifices we've made, and you can't do this one thing for your sister. The guilt was a familiar weight pressing down on my shoulders. In my first life, this was where I'd broken, where the combined pressure of family expectation and manufactured obligation had crushed my resistance. But I'd carried a different kind of weight for 45 years after that. The weight of regret, of knowing I'd betrayed myself for people who'd never appreciated the sacrifice. You've done a lot for me, I said quietly, and I'm grateful. But gratitude isn't a blank check. I'm not selling my comics. If you need money for the wedding, maybe Melissa and Trevor could work more hours. Maybe you could choose a less expensive venue. Maybe you could consider that a wedding is one day, but a marriage is supposed to be a lifetime, and starting that lifetime in debt for the sake of appearances isn't a great foundation. Get out, Melissa said. Her face had gone red, splotchy with rage. Get out of this room. Get out of my sight. I live here, I pointed out, and I'm happy to leave this conversation, though. I turned and walked toward the stairs, my heart pounding but my steps steady. Behind me, the explosion began. Melissa's voice rising in volume, my mother's soothing murmurs. Trevor's deeper tones agreeing that I was being unreasonable, my father's attempt to mediate that would ultimately side with everyone but me. I climbed the stairs and closed my bedroom door, leaning against it as the sound of argument filtered up through the floor. My hands were shaking. I'd done it. I'd actually done it. The amazing Spider-Man hash 300 lay on my bed where I'd left it, the black cover gleaming. I picked it up carefully, holding it up to the light. A small white price sticker in the corner read 75 cents. 75 cents for something that would one day be worth more than $500,000. But it wasn't just about the money. It never had been, really. This comic represented something larger. A moment when Peter Parker confronted a darkness that wore his own face. When he had to fight against something that was both him and not him. It was about reclaiming yourself from the parts that wanted to consume you. About finding your voice when everyone expected you to stay silent. I'd never understood it before. Not really. Not at 17 when I'd first read it. Not at 25 when I'd packed it away with the others. Not even at 62 when I'd seen the auction price and felt only loss. But now, standing in a room that shouldn't exist, in a body I'd already worn and discarded, I understood perfectly. I set the comic down on my desk and pulled out my old laptop, the chunky gateway with the cow-spotted logo. It took 3 full minutes to boot up, the dial-up modem screeching like a dying robot as it connected to the internet. But eventually, the primitive browser loaded, and I began to search. Comic collection insurance, climate-controlled storage, grading services, investment strategies. If I was really here, if this was really happening, then I had knowledge that no one else possessed. I knew which books would explode in value. I knew when to buy, when to sell, when to hold. Spider-Man #300 was just the beginning. But more than that, I knew who I was without the collection. I'd lived that life already. Hollow, empty, defined by the hole where my passion used to be. Never again. The rest of April passed in an eerie double vision. Every moment was simultaneously new and remembered, like rewatching a movie I'd seen decades ago. I knew what would happen, but the details kept surprising me. Small things I'd forgotten, like the way the oak tree's shadow moved across my wall in the afternoon, or the particular creak of the third stair from the top. My family stopped speaking to me. Not formally, we still lived in the same house, still passed each other in the hallway. But the warm familiarity had been replaced by a chill that settled into every interaction. My mother would make dinner for everyone except me, leaving me to fend for myself. Melissa would walk past my room with her phone pressed to her ear, loudly complaining about ungrateful siblings to her friends. My father would sigh heavily whenever he saw me, a walking disappointment. In my first life, this treatment had worn me down like water on stone. I'd lasted 6 weeks before capitulating. This time, I went to work. I'd forgotten how easy it was to get a job in 1997, before the recession, before the gig economy. Before employers expected 3 years of experience for entry-level positions. I applied at a local bookstore and was hired within a week. Minimum wage was $5.15 an hour, a pittance, but enough. I worked 20 hours a week, saving every penny. On my 18th birthday in May, I opened a safety deposit box at the bank and moved the most valuable comics into it. Spider-Man #300, the first appearances, the key issues, the books I knew would matter. Mr. Harrison at the comic shop, the same shop where I'd eventually work in my 60s, helped me set up a proper inventory system. "You've got a good eye," he told me, flipping through my collection log. "Most kids your age don't think about preservation." If only he knew. I also started buying. Not randomly, but strategically. I knew what was coming. The manga boom. The rise of graphic novels. The movies that would launch comic properties into the stratosphere. I picked up early issues of The Walking Dead when it launched in 2003. I'd have to wait a few years for that one. I made notes about which artists and writers to watch, which publishers would fold, and which would thrive. But most importantly, I learned to live with the silence at home. June arrived with heavy heat and humidity, the kind that made the air feel thick enough to swim through. Melissa's wedding preparations continued without my input or my money. They'd found the $15,000 somewhere. My mother had mentioned something about a loan, said with enough pointed emphasis to make sure I felt the weight of it. I didn't, or rather I did, but I'd carried heavier weights. One evening, I was in my room organizing my comics when my father knocked on my door. The first time he'd acknowledged my existence beyond sighs and headshakes in weeks. "Come in," I said. He entered slowly, looking around at the long boxes lining my walls, the comics in their protective sleeves, the careful organization. "You've really got a system here," he said. "Yeah, it's important to protect them properly. Bag and board every book. Keep them in a climate-controlled environment. Avoid sunlight." "Danny," he cut me off gently. "I'm not here to talk about comics." I set down the issue I'd been filing, Bone #1, which would eventually become a beloved classic, and turned to face him. "Okay." He sat on the edge of my bed, his police officer's posture never quite relaxing, even in civilian clothes. "Your mother is worried about you." "I'm fine." "Are you?" He studied my face. "You've been different since April. Quieter, more withdrawn." Not withdrawn, I wanted to say, just finally paying attention to myself instead of everyone else. "I'm fine," I repeated, just focused on my own stuff. "Your stuff." He picked up a random comic from my desk. Hellboy, Seed of Destruction #1. "These things really mean that much to you?" "Yes," I said simply. He flipped through it, looking at the artwork without really seeing it. "Your mother thinks you're punishing Melissa, punishing all of us for asking you to help." I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just not setting myself on fire to keep other people warm anymore. That's a very adult way of thinking, he said slowly. For a 17-year-old, I felt a chill run down my spine. I needed to be careful. Acting too different, knowing too much could raise questions I couldn't answer. I've been doing a lot of reading, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Psychology books, self-help stuff, trying to figure out who I am, I guess. Isn't that what being 17 is about? He set the comic down carefully, right where he'd found it. I suppose, but Danny, you have to understand, family means making sacrifices sometimes. Being there for each other. I agree, I said, but sacrifice should be voluntary, not coerced. And it should go both ways. When was the last time Melissa sacrificed anything for me? He didn't have an answer for that. I could see him trying to formulate one, his mouth opening and closing. I love my sister, I continued. I want her to be happy, but her happiness isn't my responsibility. Well, especially not at the cost of my own. That's not family. That's just martyrdom. He stood up, shaking his head. I don't know where you learned to talk like this, but it's not how we raised you. Maybe that's the problem, I said softly. He left without another word, and I returned to my comics, my hands steady, my conscience clear. Melissa's wedding day dawned with the kind of perfect blue sky that seemed designed to mock anyone who wasn't happy. I put on the suit my mother had laid out for me, the same navy suit from my first life, though it fit differently now that I knew what was coming. Everything felt both familiar and strange, like putting on someone else's skin. The ceremony was at St. Catherine's Church, the reception at some other venue they'd managed to book instead of the Ashford estate. Not the mansion with the gardens, but a nice enough hotel ballroom. Melissa looked beautiful in a dress that wasn't Vera Wang, but was still white and elaborate and everything she'd apparently needed. I sat in the third row during the ceremony, between my mother and an aunt whose name I'd forgotten in both lifetimes. I watched Melissa walk down the aisle, watched Trevor's practiced smile, watched them exchange vows that sounded beautiful and empty as wind chimes. In my first life, I'd cried during this ceremony. I'd convinced myself they were tears of happiness for my sister, but looking back, I think they'd been tears of grief, for the pieces of myself I'd sold, for the boundaries I'd failed to set, for the person I was in the process of not becoming. This time, my eyes stayed dry. At the reception, I made the obligatory rounds, accepting congratulations from relatives who didn't know what to say to me now that the family story had painted me as the villain. I ate rubber chicken and drank weak punch and watched people dance to Unforgettable, and at last, and all the wedding standards that would still be wedding standards 27 years later. Melissa found me near the end of the night, standing by the windows overlooking the hotel parking lot. "You came," she said. Her makeup was slightly smudged, her updo starting to list to one side. "Of course I came. You're my sister?" Even though I'm such a bridezilla, there was an edge to her voice, testing. "You wanted a nice wedding? There's nothing wrong with that." She studied me, her eyes narrowed. "Why are you being so calm? I thought you'd be, I don't know, angry, hurt." "I'm not angry," I said truthfully. "I hope you and Trevor are very happy together." I meant it in a way. I hoped she'd find happiness, even though I knew the road ahead. The fights, the infidelity, the divorce, then the second marriage, which would last 3 years, then the third, which might still be going in this timeline, or might not. I'd lost touch with most of my family in my 40s, the distance growing until it became a chasm neither side wanted to bridge. "Mom says you've been working at a bookstore," Melissa said, changing the subject. "Saving money." "Yeah." "For what? College?" I could have told her. Could have explained that I was saving for my future, for the investments I knew would pay off, for the security that would let me live comfortably instead of scraping by, but she wouldn't understand. Couldn't understand. "Something like that," I said. She opened her mouth to say something else, but Trevor appeared, slightly drunk and insisting on one more dance. She let him pull her away, glancing back at me once with an expression I couldn't read. I left the reception early, catching a ride home with my aunt. The house was empty when I arrived. Everyone still at the hotel celebrating. I climbed the stairs to my room, took off the suit, and sat at my desk in the darkness. The amazing Spider-Man #300 was in the safety deposit box, protected and preserved. But I had a reading copy, a backup I'd bought from Mr. Harrison's shop for $5. I pulled it out now and opened it, the pages crackling softly under my fingers. There was a panel near the end where Spider-Man finally confronts Venom, where he realizes that this creature knows everything about him, all his secrets and weaknesses, because it's part of him, and he has to find a way to fight it anyway, to separate himself from this darkness that wants to consume him. "We're not so different, Spider-Man," Venom says in one of those classic villain lines. "We both wear masks. But the difference, I thought, was that Peter Parker chose his mask, chose who he wanted to be, what he wanted to fight for, what mattered to him. The symbiote wanted to make those choices for him, wanted to subsume his identity into something else. I'd worn a mask for 17 years in my first life. The dutiful son, the compliant brother, the person who said yes when he meant no, who sacrificed when he should have stood firm, who let other people's needs erase his own boundaries. That mask had suffocated me slowly. Oh, so gradually I hadn't even noticed until I was 62 and wondering where my life had gone. This time, I was choosing differently. I closed the comic carefully and slipped it back into its sleeve. Outside, I could hear cars pulling into the driveway, the sound of my family returning from the celebration. Their voices carried through the night air. Happy, tired, satisfied. I didn't go downstairs to greet them. I stayed in my room, surrounded by my carefully organized collection, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, in this life or the last, I felt something like peace. The summer passed in a strange rhythm of isolation and purpose. My family continued to treat me like a ghost, present but unacknowledged, and I found I preferred it that way. No more demands, no more guilt trips. No more expectations that I would set myself ablaze to provide light for everyone else. I worked at the bookstore, saved my money, and expanded my collection strategically. Mr. Harrison at the comic shop became something like a mentor, though he didn't know he was teaching someone who already knew the lessons. We'd talk for hours about the industry, about trends, about what made a comic valuable beyond just rarity. "It's the cultural impact," he told me one afternoon in July, the shop's air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the heat. "A book can be rare as hell, but if nobody cares about the character or the story, it's still just paper. The valuable ones are the ones that matter to people." That changed something. That stuck in the cultural consciousness. I thought about Spider-Man #300, about Venom, about how that character had evolved from a villain to an anti-hero to a franchise unto himself. How in 2018, there would be a movie that would make hundreds of millions of dollars. How the character would become iconic, not despite his darkness, but because of it. A reflection of what we feared in ourselves, made external and somehow manageable. "What do you think will matter?" I asked Mr. Harrison. "Looking forward, I mean. What characters? What stories?" He laughed, a rich sound that filled the small shop. "If I knew that kid, I'd be a rich man. But I'll tell you what, I tell everyone who asks, collect what you love. Chase the money and you'll always be disappointed. Chase the passion, and even if the money never comes, you'll still have something worthwhile." It was good advice. I was just lucky enough to do both. August brought my senior year of high school, a stretch of time I'd both dreaded and anticipated. In my first life, I'd sleepwalked through it, too hollowed out by the comic sale to engage with much of anything. I'd graduated with mediocre grades, no real plans, and a vague sense that I'd already failed at life before it really started. This time, I showed up, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. I joined the school newspaper, writing reviews of comics and graphic novels that my teacher found surprisingly sophisticated. I tutored underclassmen in English and history, subjects that came easy to me now that I'd lived through the decades we were studying. I even tried out for the Quiz Bowl team and made it. My teammates baffled by how much random trivia I knew. It's like you've lived twice as long as the rest of us," Sarah Chen said. No relation, different family, but she sat next to me in AP Literature. She'd been my friend in the first timeline too. Though we'd lost touch after graduation when I'd spiraled into the depression I wouldn't recognize or treat for years. "Sometimes I feel like that," I admitted. She tilted her head, studying me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're different this year. More present? It's nice." "Thanks," I said, and meant it. We became closer as the year progressed, Sarah and I. Not romantically, she was dating a guy named Marcus who played varsity basketball, but as genuine friends. We'd have long conversations about books, about philosophy, about what we wanted from life. She wanted to be a lawyer, to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. What about you? She asked one day in October, the leaves outside turning gold and crimson. What do you want? I want to not have regrets, I said. I want to make choices that matter to me, not just to everyone around me. I want to build something that's mine. Your comics, she said. Yeah, but more than that. A life. A real one. One where I don't wake up at 60 wondering where the time went. She gave me a strange look. 60's a long way off, Danny. Closer than you think, I said softly. By the time December rolled around, I'd saved nearly $3,000 from my bookstore job. It wasn't much, not in the grand scheme of things, but it was a foundation. I'd also built relationships with several comic dealers, established myself as a serious collector despite my age, and started a small side business buying and selling books I knew would appreciate. My family still wasn't speaking to me. Not really. Melissa had moved out, living with Trevor in an apartment across town. My parents treated me with polite distance, as if I were a tenant rather than their son. We'd exchange pleasantries at dinner, when we ate together, which was rare. But the warmth was gone, replaced by a chill that no amount of forced civility could thaw. I didn't mind as much as I thought I would. Christmas was awkward, everyone exchanging gifts with manufactured cheer. Melissa gave me a sweater that was 2 sizes too large. I gave her a gift card to her favorite restaurant. We smiled, thanked each other, and went back to our separate corners. In my first life, I'd spent that Christmas drunk, stumbling through the motions, desperately trying to fill the void where my collection used to be. I'd picked a fight with Trevor about something stupid, politics or sports I couldn't even remember. The fight had escalated until my father had to separate us, and I'd left the house at midnight, walking through the snow until my feet went numb. This time, I left at 11, sober and clear-headed, and drove to the 24-hour diner on Route 47. I sat in a booth by the window, drinking coffee and reading a first edition of Watchmen that I'd protected in plastic, and watched the snow fall in soft drifts. The waitress, her name tag said Brenda, kept refilling my cup without being asked. Around 2 a.m, when the place was empty except for us and a truck driver at the counter, she sat down across from me. That a comic book? She asked. Graphic novel? I corrected gently. But yeah. What's it about? I thought about how to explain Watchmen, that dense meditation on power and responsibility, and the corruption of ideals. It's about heroes who aren't heroes anymore, who compromise so much to save the world that they lost themselves in the process, and one who refuses to compromise, even if it means watching everything burn. She nodded slowly. Sounds depressing. It is, I agreed, but it's also beautiful and honest. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that tell you hard truths. Like what? Like sometimes there's no good choice. Sometimes every option is bad and you just have to pick the one you can live with. I paused, thinking about my own choices. The family ties I'd frayed by refusing to bend. And sometimes choosing yourself over what everyone expects isn't selfish, it's survival. Brenda was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. I needed to hear that, she said finally. Thank you. She got up to attend to the truck driver, leaving me with my coffee and my comic and the snow falling outside. And I felt sitting there alone on Christmas night more content than I'd felt in either lifetime during the holidays. Because this time, I'd chosen to be alone. It wasn't loneliness forced on me by depression or circumstance. It was solitude that I'd carved out, space that was mine. There was power in that. 1998 arrived with little fanfare. I graduated high school in June with honors, a fact that seemed to surprise everyone except Sarah, who hugged me at graduation and made me promise to keep in touch. Don't disappear on me, she said. I know how you are. You get lost in your own head and forget the world exists. I won't, I promised, and this time I meant to keep it. I'd been accepted to the state university, but I deferred enrollment. In my first life, I'd gone straight to college, majored in something vague like communications, dropped out after 2 years when the money ran out, and spent the next 40 years drifting from job to job, never quite landing anywhere. This time, I had a plan. I rented a small studio apartment, the kind of place that would have depressed me before, but now felt like freedom. It was mine. Every stick of furniture, every comic box carefully arranged, every choice about how to spend my time, all mine. I worked full-time at the bookstore and started doing freelance writing on the side, reviews, articles about the comic industry, essays about collecting. The internet was young but growing, and there were websites hungry for content. I wrote under a pseudonym, building a portfolio and a small following. And I waited, because I knew what was coming. I knew about 9/11s, about the wars, about the financial crash. I knew about the dot-com bubble and when it would burst. I knew about Apple's resurgence, about Google's rise, about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. I knew which companies would fail and which would soar. I couldn't prevent the tragedies. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on my shoulders, especially about 9/11s, when it came. I'd known it was coming for 4 years, and there was nothing I could do. No way to warn anyone without sounding insane. No way to stop it. When it happened, I called Sarah, who was in her second year of law school. "I keep thinking about all the things that could have been different," she said, her voice raw from crying. "All the little choices that led to this moment." "Me too," I said quietly, but I used the knowledge I had to make smaller choices. Better choices. I bought Apple stock when everyone said the company was dead. I invested in Google at the IPO. I bought Bitcoin when it was launched in 2009, when each coin cost pennies, and everyone thought it was a joke. And I protected my comics. The amazing Spider-Man #300 stayed in its climate-controlled safety deposit box, pristine and perfect. I checked on it twice a year, just to make sure it was still there, still real. A talisman, a reminder of the choice I'd made. The years passed in a strange acceleration, each one feeling both endless and instant. I turned 21, then 25, then 30. My collection grew, carefully curated, each edition deliberate. I dated occasionally, but never seriously, too aware of how relationships could derail a life, too focused on building something stable. My family and I maintained a cordial distance. We'd see each other at holidays, exchange pleasantries, share surface-level updates. Melissa got divorced from Trevor in 2009, just as I'd known she would. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished, and I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but not enough to let her back into my life in any meaningful way. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. My mother never quite forgave me for the comics. Even years later, she'd make little comments, needling references to my selfishness that she'd dress up as jokes. "Still have those picture books?" she'd ask at Thanksgiving dinner. "Must be nice to have hobbies instead of responsibilities." I'd smile and change the subject, refusing to engage. My father, at least, came around somewhat. In 2015, when I bought my first house, paid in cash thanks to careful investments, he'd walked through it with something like pride in his eyes. "You've done well for yourself," he said, standing in my office where the most valuable comics were displayed in custom cases. I'll admit, I didn't think, "Well, I'm glad you proved me wrong." "Thanks, Dad," I said, and meant it. He picked up one of my price guides, flipping through it. "Are these things really worth what it says here?" "Some of them are worth more," I said. To me, the market's been climbing steadily, especially for key issues and first appearances. "Huh," he set the guide down. "That one you wouldn't sell for Melissa's wedding. The Spider-Man, you still have that?" "Yeah." "What's it worth now?" In 2015, a high-grade copy of Amazing Spider-Man #300 had sold for around $12,000. Mine was better than high-grade. It was near mint, possibly gem mint if I ever got it professionally graded. "Enough," I said. He nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology. We shouldn't have asked you to give that up. Your mother and I, we thought we were teaching you about family, about sacrifice, but I think maybe we were just taking the easy way out, using you to solve a problem that wasn't yours to solve. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and I accepted it with grace." "It's in the past," I said. And it was, both literally and figuratively. The years continued their march. 2016, 2017, 2018. I watched the Marvel movies launch and soar, watched characters I'd loved in ink and paper come to life on screen. Each announcement, each casting decision, each box office record felt like vindication, not of my refusal to sell, but of the passion I'd protected. The comics weren't just valuable because they were rare. They were valuable because they mattered, because the stories they told had resonated across generations, had shaped culture, had become part of our collective mythology. Mr. Harrison passed away in 2019, leaving me his comic shop in his will. I'd been his most loyal customer and had helped him manage the store for years as a side project. It felt right, stepping into that space, surrounded by the smell of ink and paper, helping new collectors find their passion the way he'd helped me protect mine. Sarah visited sometimes, now a successful defense attorney with 2 kids and a husband she adored. "You seem happy," she said during one visit, watching me help a teenage girl find the first issue of Miss Marvel. "I am," I said. "No regrets." I thought about that question, about the family relationships that had frayed, about the loneliness of my 20s and early 30s, about the sacrifices I'd made to protect my boundaries. "A few," I admitted, "but not the big one, not the one that would have defined everything else." She understood somehow. She always had. And then it was 2024, January, specifically. A Saturday morning, the kind of crisp winter day that made everything feel sharp and clear. I was in the shop, reorganizing the back issue bins, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a New York area code. I almost didn't answer. Probably spam, probably someone selling something, but something made me pick up. "Is this Daniel Chen?" A woman's voice, professional and excited. Speaking. "Mr. Chen, my name is Jennifer Lawson. I'm with Heritage Auctions. We specialize in comic books and collectibles." My heart started beating faster. "Okay." "We've been contacted by a collector who owns one of the finest known copies of the Amazing Spider-Man #300. He's interested in selling, and we're putting together a major auction. In preparing for this, we've been researching the book's history, trying to locate other high-grade copies. Your name came up in several vintage dealer databases as someone who acquired a near-mint copy back in the late 80s. We wanted to reach out and see if you'd be interested in having your copy graded and possibly included in the auction." I sat down on a stack of long boxes, my legs suddenly unsteady. "You're putting together an auction for Spider-Man #300? "Yes, we believe with the right presentation and the current market conditions, the Venom movie popularity, the general surge in comic valuations, a pristine copy could potentially break records for a modern comic." "What kind of records?" "Well, we're being conservative in our estimates, but based on recent sales and market analysis." She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "We think it could go for anywhere between $400,000 and $600,000. $500,000. Just like I'd known it would." I was quiet for so long, she said, "Mr. Chen? Are you still there?" "I'm here," I managed. "Just processing." "I understand it's a lot to take in, but if you're interested, we'd love to have you send your copy to be graded by CGC. If it comes back at 9.8 or above, it could be the star of the auction. We're looking at a June sale date, which gives us time to market it properly." June. 27 years, almost to the day from when I'd first refused to sell it. "I need some time to think about it," I said. "Of course. Here's my direct number. Call anytime." She gave me her information, we exchanged pleasantries, and I hung up. I sat there in the back room of the comic shop, surrounded by thousands upon thousands of stories, each one a little piece of someone's imagination made real. And I thought about the journey that had brought me here, not the physical one from my bedroom at 17 to this shop at 51, but the metaphysical one, the impossible one. I'd been given a second chance, a literal rebirth, and I'd used it to make one different choice. Just one. Everything else had flowed from that. Not selling the comics meant not hollowing myself out. Not hollowing myself out meant having the energy to invest in myself, my education, my future. Investing in myself meant having the confidence to make smart financial decisions. Smart financial decisions meant security, which meant peace of mind, which meant the ability to be generous in the ways that mattered. Not by sacrificing myself, but by building something strong enough to share. I'd helped put 3 kids through college with anonymous scholarships. I'd funded local artists and writers through grants at the shop. I'd created a life that had meaning beyond accumulation. And now, after all these years, the universe was offering me $500,000 for a comic book I'd bought for 75 cents. I could sell it. God knows I could use the money. The shop was doing fine, but $500,000 would set me up for life, would let me expand, would let me do so much more. Or I could keep it, could hold on to this tangible reminder of the moment I'd chosen myself, the moment everything changed. I sat with the question for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the shop, the hum of the air conditioning, the tick of the clock on the wall. And then I smiled. I called Jennifer Lawson back 3 days later. "I've thought about it. I said, and I appreciate the offer. But I'm not interested in selling. There was a pause. Mr. Chen, I want to make sure you understand the potential value we're talking about here. $500,000 for a single comic book. That's life-changing money. I know, I said gently, and I'm grateful you thought of me. But this particular book, it's not about the money. It never has been. I see. She sounded disappointed but professional. Well, if you ever change your mind, my door is open. And if you'd still like to have it graded for your own records, I can help facilitate that. Thank you. I might take you up on that. We said our goodbyes, and I hung up feeling lighter somehow, despite passing on $500,000. Because I'd learned something in my 2 lifetimes, the value of a thing isn't always measured in money. Sometimes it's measured in the choices it represents, the boundaries it protects, the person it helps you become. I could have sold that comic for $3 in 1997 and hated myself forever. I could sell it for $500,000 in 2024 and always wonder if I'd made the right choice. Or I could keep it, this piece of paper and ink that had somehow become a cornerstone of my entire existence, and know that some things are worth more than their market value. Some things are priceless. Of course, the story didn't end there. Word got out, as it does in the comic community. Heritage's auction proceeded without my copy, but the publicity around it was massive. Articles in major publications, news segments on late-night shows, social media threads arguing about whether any comic was worth $500,000. The auction took place in June, just as planned. The featured copy, a CGC 9.8, sold for $525,000. I watched the auction live stream from the shop, Sarah sitting next to me. She'd made the drive specifically for this, knowing what it meant, even if she didn't fully understand why. When the hammer fell at $525,000, she turned to me. That could have been you. Yeah, I said. No regrets? I thought about it. Really thought about it. $500,000, what I could do with that money, the security it would bring, the options it would open. Then I thought about the first time I'd held that comic. 17 years old and reborn into a body I'd already worn. The weight of it in my hands. The choice it represented. The life it had helped me build. Not through its monetary value, but through what it symbolized. The refusal to be erased. The insistence on mattering. The courage to choose myself. No regrets, I said. Sarah squeezed my hand. Good. A year later, I finally did get the comic graded. Not to sell it, but because Jennifer had been right, it deserved proper preservation and authentication. It came back a CGC 9.9. Mint. Nearly perfect. One of the highest graded copies in existence. I had it mounted in a custom display case in my office at the shop, alongside a small placard that read, "Not for sale. Some things are worth more than money." People would come by to see it sometimes, collectors and casual fans alike. They'd take photos, tell their friends, offer me increasingly absurd amounts of money for it. I always said no, because in the end, this comic had already given me everything it possibly could. It had given me back myself. Well, that was worth more than any auction price. I turned 62 in March of 2035. The same age I'd been when I died in my first life, alone in a studio apartment, surrounded by regret and might-have-beens. This time, I woke up in my own house, in a comfortable bed, to the sound of birds outside my window. I made coffee in my kitchen. I fed my cat. This one was named Kirby, after Jack Kirby, and he was affectionate and spoiled. I walked to the shop I owned, through a neighborhood where people knew my name and greeted me warmly. Sarah called to wish me happy birthday. Her kids now in college, her life full and busy, but still with room for old friends. 62? She said. The big one. Why is 62 the big one? I asked, genuinely curious what she meant. Because you told me once, years ago, that you wanted to make it to 62 without regrets. Said it like it was important. Like there was a specific reason. I'd forgotten telling her that. But of course I had. 62 was the age I'd been when everything ended in my first life. The age I'd needed to reach and surpass in this one. Did I make it? I asked her. You tell me, she said. I looked around my shop, at the walls lined with comics, at the community board covered in photos of customers and their collections, at the reading corner where kids would come after school to discover new worlds. I thought about the life I'd built, choice by choice, boundary by boundary. The family relationships that had healed somewhat with time and distance, the friendships that had deepened, the passion I'd protected and nurtured. "Yeah," I said. "I think I made it." After we hung up, I walked to my office and stood in front of the display case holding the amazing Spider-Man #300. The CGC case gleamed under the lights, the comic inside as pristine as the day I'd bought it 47 years ago. In the story, Peter Parker fights Venom in a church bell tower. The symbiote hates the sound of the bells, and Peter uses that weakness to free himself, to separate the alien darkness from his own identity. He could have let it consume him, could have accepted its power, and lost himself in the process. But he chose himself instead, just like I had. I pressed my hand against the glass of the display case, feeling the cool surface under my palm. "Thank you," I whispered to the comic, to the character, to the younger version of myself who'd had the courage to say no. "Thank you for everything." And in that moment, I could swear I felt something, a warmth, a recognition, a sense of rightness that transcended time and possibility. I'd been given an impossible gift, a second chance to live my life differently, and I'd used it well. Not to get rich, though I was comfortable, not to become famous, though I was respected in my community, but to become myself, fully, completely, without apology or compromise. That was the real treasure. That was worth more than all the money in the world. 2045. I sold the shop when I turned 72, passing it on to a young collector named Maria, who reminded me of myself at 17. Fierce, passionate, uncompromising in her love for the medium. "Take care of this place," I told her on her first day as owner. "It's more than a business. It's a sanctuary for people who need to know they're not alone in loving what they love." "I will," she promised. I kept my collection, though, downsized it somewhat, sold the investment pieces that had appreciated nicely, kept the ones that mattered to my heart, the amazing Spider-Man. #300 went with me to my retirement, to a small house by the ocean where I could hear the waves and smell the salt air. One evening, as the sun set over the water, my nephew came to visit. Melissa's son, now in his 30s, working as a social worker and living a life his mother still didn't quite understand. "Uncle Dan," he said, standing in front of the display case that still held pride of place in my living room, "why didn't you ever sell this? I've heard the story 1,000 times. $500,000? More now, probably. Oh, you could be living like a king." "I am living like a king," I said. "I have everything I need. Peace, purpose, no regrets." "But the money would have changed my life," I interrupted gently. "You're right about that, but not necessarily for the better. Money's a tool, not a goal. And the tool I needed wasn't cash. It was the courage to choose myself. This comic gave me that. Selling it would have been like selling my spine." He looked at the comic for a long time, at the black-clad figure of Venom snarling from the cover. "I think I get it," he said finally. "It's not about the comic. It's about what it represents." "Now you're getting it," I said. He stayed for dinner, and we talked about his work, his struggles with his own family expectations, his fear of disappointing people. "Here's what I learned," I told him as we sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "Disappointing people is inevitable. You can't please everyone, but you can choose who to disappoint, and I'd rather disappoint people who want me to be smaller than disappoint myself by actually becoming smaller." "That's good advice," he said. "Hard one?" I replied. After he left, I sat alone with my thoughts and my memories, both sets of them, the life I'd lived and the life I'd relived. The roads diverged, both traveled in full, and somehow I'd ended up here, at peace, complete. I'd learned that second chances aren't about getting everything right. They're about getting the important things right, about choosing the battles that matter, setting the boundaries that protect your soul, and letting go of the guilt that comes from other people's disappointment in your refusal to self-immolate. The amazing Spider-Man, #300 was worth millions now, according to the latest auction records I'd seen. An investment that would have set up generations of my family. But I looked at it, there in its case, and I didn't see dollar signs. I saw a 17-year-old boy with too much knowledge and too little confidence, making the hardest choice of his young life. I saw a 30-year-old man building a foundation, brick by careful brick. I saw a 62-year-old surviving the age that had killed him before and thriving. I saw myself, all the versions I'd been and might have been, distilled into this single artifact. Priceless. Not because it was worth millions, but because it was worth me. And in the end, and that was the only valuation that mattered. The waves crashed against the shore in their eternal rhythm. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. And I sat in my house by the sea, surrounded by the things I loved, having lived 2 lives and learned the same lesson from both. The most valuable thing you can ever own is yourself. Everything else is just paper and ink. Beautiful, meaningful, important paper and ink. But still, just paper and ink. The human soul, though, that's the real collector's item. That's the one you protect at all costs. That's the one you never, ever sell.